In this video, I'm going to introduce some concepts about ceilings, both in terms of structure and decorative treatments as well. So when we think about ceilings and the surface finishes that we might find for a ceiling, we can really be thinking about the same things that we do to walls. So if you can do it to a wall, you can probably, treat the ceiling the same way. Typically, ceilings are drywall, also known as sheetrock or gyp or gypsum, or plaster or wood paneling, for example. These materials are attached to the trusses, joists, or rafters above. We can have a variety of ceiling treatments that we'll be looking at, exposed beams, decorative moldings, tin, basically, again, anything that you can put on your walls. We can also do things with suspended grids that are suspended with guy wires and have acoustic tiles. We can have integrated ceiling systems that have lighting built in. There's a whole world of ceiling options out there. So when we think about the structure of a ceiling, in this case we are seeing a soffit, so a dropped portion of a ceiling that's built to be maybe about 12 inches lower. We're really thinking about a similar system to how the walls are built in some sense. So there is a structure behind what you're seeing in a space. So on top of that system, on top of either the wood or metal studs, again, like we have in the walls, we have drywall very often. And that drywall, keep in mind, needs to be not only cut to fit, screwed in, but then all of the joints, the screws, the seams, have to be taped, mudded, and smoothed. So it's a whole process. So here we can see them actually smoothing a skim coat on top of the drywall. And this would be in a cove ceiling. And then we can also have lath and plaster. So much like the walls where we have the studs, in this case generally wood, with the thin lath strips running across, and then the plaster then is kind of pushed into that and adhered to that lath. Just like the walls, it can be done on a ceiling as well. In particular, on a plaster ceiling, we'll see the opportunities for moldings and trim work and a lot of detail. We can also put plaster moldings on top of drywall as well, so it could go either way. But so you have the opportunity to add a variety of details that are very decorative. And so here's just a few examples of current, intricate plaster molding details that you could think about doing on a ceiling. And so these are generally modular kinds of parts that are then adhered to the ceiling surface and then smoothed and painted over. In this case, we have the center rosette that we can then hang a chandelier or something like that from. So they come in all different shapes and sizes and configurations. With a ceiling, whether it's drywall or plaster, we can also have a cove element. And a cove is really where we have this dropped area around the perimeter, and then it recedes upward into the ceiling cavity. And then around that perimeter edge, which could vary in depth and thickness, we usually have lighting installed and get that cove lighting effect, both inside to create that strip of glow, but then also you can see that flush recessed lights are installed on the flat edge of the cove as well. Here's another example. Has a very polished, beautiful look. And here we have lighting actually on the inside of the cove and the exterior of the cove as well. We can also have wood beams on our ceilings, and these can vary pretty dramatically from being somewhat contemporary to very rustic. So, here we're seeing this sort of light, almost sort of pickle-stained wood across the top. And so really the idea in a lot of these cases is that it's like you're seeing the structure, and that we don't have a drywall or a plaster, but that we're seeing the structure very often. We can have very contemporary wood beam ceilings, and in this case we don't really perceive that so much as a structure, but this additional element, and these very close together parallel beams running through, and then the light is integrated in between them. You can have very rustic examples where they're either parallel or cross or both, with maybe even wood in the back, integrated lighting. Example, they can be flat, they can be curved, as in this example, so they don't necessarily have to be straight. But they have a very profound effect on our space, our perception of volume and height. Here we have an example of this high contrast dark wood against the white ceiling and walls, and how that beam is actually coming down and kind of notching in that corner and then down the wall a little bit. Another example of exposed wood beam and trusses, and really contrasting that, just pointing out this marvelous huge fireplace. We can have a fairly monochromatic look where the beams and the walls are similar tones. So we've seen a lot of dark wood examples. The wood can be a very light tone as well. We can have a very simple wood beam structure where it's just a few beams running across the room, drywall, lighting in between in this case. And actually, on a fairly low ceiling, it has a nice effect. Similar, but having that cross or creating those rectilinear shapes with those beams. You can also have a very rustic look, and here we're actually using actual trees. So the tree and these branches coming out, so that very raw, kind of unfinished look, so it gives it a very organic quality in the space. And it can really be that these beams could actually be these round timbers. They don't have to be square. And using a chevron pattern in the background on the ceiling. And this whole space, the character is really coming from that ceiling element. And then these very large modern windows, and then our herringbone pattern on the floor. So a very simple space, highly defined in part by that ceiling element. It's a very simple, clean, white space with skylights, the white beams running through. Okay, and an example of a vaulted ceiling with exposed beams, wood as the actual surface finish, and very symmetrical with the fireplace running up through the center. We can also have coffered ceilings. So coffered ceilings, in a sense, have a similar look to those beamed ceilings, but this time the structures are made out of trims and molding, so it's not just this exposed beam. It's not as if we are seeing the structure of the building. These are, more of a surface application, and so they're, more delicate and more polished. And with the coffered look, you're creating these boxes with the trims and molding pieces, and then often there's lighting in between. Okay, so here you see another example that's similar, painted white, lighting in between, but then there's also that strip of lighting in each of those boxes. Okay. Another example, all this matching, coordinating dark woodwork that's original to this structure, and seeing how that carries all the way from the floorboards, the wainscoting and paneling, the casing around the windows, and the opening into the next room, up to that beautiful coffered ceiling, and then that very symmetrical fixture hanging down over what I assume would be the dining table space in that room. Another example, just kind of pointing out that you can play with textures and colors and that sort of positive negative feel. So here we have the trim work painted in white, and then the actual surface of the ceiling is this darker beadboard wood paneling. Okay. Another very classic example of this just kind of intense paneled woodwork. It's very beautiful, very dense, and has a very solid kind of heavy quality to it that really defines the room. This room would feel completely different without that coffered ceiling, there's no doubt. We can also think about tin ceilings. So pressed tin ceilings were very common, and they're still common today. So we think of them in all kinds of applications. In particular, we tend to think of them in retail or restaurant applications, in older buildings. So here we're seeing, these gentlemen standing underneath this beautiful original pressed tin ceiling. Here would be another application. We often see them in taverns, pubs, restaurants again. And so you're seeing this elaborate tin ceiling with special attention to these kind of rosettes where the light fixtures are coming down, and then transitional trim, different size pieces. And then the tin is actually coming down the wall with this crown molding piece. And following down to the wall structure here. So very elaborate, very detailed. Okay, an old example, this is more of an organic quality to it, but in a residential setting rather than a commercial setting. Okay. Here's a shot of someone actually pulling out and salvaging some old original tin ceiling, which over the years, maybe it started out as a metallic color but has been painted, which they can be different shades of metal or painted. Okay, see, this gentleman's really excited about his original tin ceiling in his apartment. Okay, and then some more contemporary examples. So it's not only that we have to find or salvage, old pressed tin ceiling, but you can get newly produced tin ceiling. It can be plastic or it can actually be metal. The old original molds still exist and are still being produced today, and so it creates a very fancy, opulent quality to it. Here's an example in a barber shop, right? So depending on the finish, it can either be sort of subdued and simple or very eye-catching, right? So the tone, the color, the pattern have a dramatic effect on what we see, and if we have that sort of salvage pieced together look in many colors. And we can also sort of integrate this beautiful old ornate ceiling into a more kind of contemporary industrial look. They can work in commercial and residential settings. Again, seeing not only the paneling itself, but the cove coming down the wall. And they can also be very simple. There are a lot of patterns out there, some more ornate than others, and some more large scale than others. So here would be a very simple grid pattern going across that entire ceiling, and much more modern and contemporary than some of the other examples we've seen. And we can even have tin ceiling inside of a coffered ceiling structure. So these aren't all necessarily standalone. There can be combinations that are appropriate. We can also have suspended ceiling systems, so systems that are hanging, again, from those guy wires, and then there are basically small beams, these systems that the tiles lay in, and you'll see this very commonly in commercial settings, but sometimes it's also in residential settings as well. So first, this grid structure is actually installed, and then those tiles are laid inside of it. So here's an example that is extremely simple, white, and sort of you just kind of don't really think about it too much. And this is really commonly done as a cost-saving measure, especially if there's an old plaster ceiling or something behind it that was breaking down. This could actually be installed over it. They can be installed for acoustic reasons. And sometimes they're installed because you can actually create a gap between the ceiling and the structure above that you can put in HVAC. So, the ductwork that you need or lighting, things like that, you can actually pop these tiles out and then access those systems. They can have very dramatically different looks. So these are all considered suspended ceilings, but they have very different styles. So here the grid system is extremely predominant. And this really is mimicking a coffered ceiling look, but it's actually a suspended ceiling. So it's doing the same basic look, but at a reduced cost. Here would be another example, but so instead of these being metal and attached to the ceiling, it's very likely that these are actually like a plastic, and they're actually suspended in that grid. It's possible they're metal, but unlikely. Here again, so kind of mimicking that look of a coffered ceiling with the tile laying in there, but it's actually a suspended system. It's not, true wood, and it's not attached to the ceiling itself. Another example, so we're seeing more of that clean contemporary grid. This time it's very exposed, and then we're laying those decorative panels inside of that. Okay. Another example, and this starts to get into more of that commercial look that we will commonly think of. So we see the grid again. All of those wood panels are laying loosely into that grid, and then all those little dots you're seeing are actually for acoustics, so to help with the sound absorption and keeping the room quieter. So there's a lot of pros to doing a suspended ceiling if it's appropriate. Here we're seeing something that's very contemporary, ultra modern. So everything has its place. And, here's this sort of coffered ceiling type of look again, but just kind of thinking about, again, options are endless. This actually has like a fiber optic system built into it. So there's like glowing lights, kind of like you're at a planetarium or something. All right, so be inspired and get excited about designing your ceilings because they really define a space.